Welcome back. Irish art of the early Middle Ages is one of the most popular manifestations of the Celtic phenomenon. Artifacts like the Book of Kells draw hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, and motifs from the Book of Kells can be found on literally everything with a surface, from clothing and jewelry to housewares and beyond. This fascination with Irish art dates from the 19th century, when the idea that there was a distinctive Celtic style of art first arose. At that point, scholars looked at the art of Ireland and the British Isles in the early Middle Ages and identified certain elements that seemed to set this art apart from other art styles. By this point, the idea of the Celts as a distinctive people with their own language and culture was well advanced, so it made sense to extend the concept to art. This was a period of spectacular archaeological finds, both on the European continent and in Britain and Ireland, and the scholars who studied these finds assumed, as we have seen in earlier lectures, that the people who produced these artifacts were all Celts. We have seen that this is a somewhat problematic notion. The people who produced this art had no idea that anyone would ever label it as Celtic. The people who originated the Latin art style we associate with the Celts may not have been Celtic speakers at all. This was a popular style in many parts of Europe where many different languages were spoken. The style arose in Central Europe and then spread outwards to encompass much of Gaul. But there is not a perfect correspondence between areas of Celtic speech and areas where this art style was found. Ironically, this style arguably reached its most sophisticated development on the fringes of the area where it was originally popular, in what we think of now as the Celtic fringe. It is this late flowering of the Celtic art style in the late Iron Age and early Christian period that I want to look at in this lecture. I want to cover two main topics. First, we will look at the spread of Celtic-style art from the continent to the British Isles and Ireland before the coming of Christianity, and then we will look at what happened to this art in the early Christian period. Let me start with a quick word about terminology. When talking about Celtic art in the British Isles and Ireland, scholars are faced with the difficulty of deciding whether a particular work was made in Ireland or Britain, because, as we'll see, there was such a broad similarity all across this region among artifacts produced in this style. Thus, scholars often refer to this art style in one of two ways. If they're talking about the period after the Germanic migrations to Britain, they might call this art Hiberno-Saxon, which is one way to hedge their bets. The term suggests that the art style is a blend of Irish and English elements. But it is more common to use an even more general term and simply call it insular art, from the fact that it was produced on an island, maybe Ireland, maybe Britain. In some cases, we aren't even sure. So when we say insular art, we're talking about Celtic-style art in Britain and Ireland. You'll remember that when we talked about the rise of the cultures on the continent that we associate with the site of La Tène in Switzerland, we discussed some of the characteristics of this art that were especially prominent. This is a very stylized art. The figures we see are not intended to be realistic. They're meant to suggest the figures, not represent them. This art also emphasizes repeating patterns and abstract elements. Sometimes these are geometric, but often they are curvilinear, with a lot of spiral forms and interlacing forms. The patterns can be almost mesmerizing. If you start trying to unravel the threads, so to speak, you can end up losing yourself in a kind of meditative trance. The early continental art in this style does not emphasize the complete human figure, although you do see lots of depictions of human heads. So, as we saw earlier, this art style became wildly popular in large parts of Europe, including Central Europe and Gaul, but it was only represented in a very scattered way in Spain. And in fact, the areas where this art was popular were in some cases cut off from each other by land, and thus the style probably had to have been spread at least partly by sea, even on the European mainland, surely due to trading contacts up and down the Atlantic coast of Europe. It is thus even more clearly the case that trading contacts probably brought the La Tène style to Britain and Ireland, sometime in the centuries right before Christ. What we find in Britain and Ireland is a bit complicated, though. The art of this style that we find is broadly similar, so you find artifacts all over this region that have broadly similar designs, whether they come from Britain or from Ireland. For example, you might find a brooch from the north of Ireland that looks remarkably similar to a shield mount from the south of Britain. Both pieces might use the same motif, such as the spiral shape known as the triskel. So in some ways, this art was using older models and creating a broadly coherent style across a wide geographical area. But here's the odd thing. I just mentioned that we might find similarities between objects found in Northern Ireland and Southern Britain. Just as we found on the continent, this art style in Britain and Ireland is not evenly distributed. It's not found everywhere. It's much more solidly attested in the north of Ireland than the south of Ireland, which is somewhat surprising, since you would think that the South would be more open to trading contacts. But we must be seeing the evidence of trade routes that operated in ways we cannot otherwise recover. The point is that this is not an Irish style or a British style. It's not even a Southern style or a Northern style. It's a style that some groups of people living in these islands adopted and others did not. And we may never know why. So how is the art that we find in Britain and Ireland related to the art we find on the continent at the same time? As I've said in earlier lectures, it used to be thought that the art style came to Britain as part of a Celtic invasion, but scholars no longer believe in this invasion theory. One reason is that the art we see in Britain and Ireland is subtly different from what we see on the continent. The motifs are very similar, yes, but they are produced in slightly different ways. It's much more as if native craftspeople in Britain are copying work that they have seen, possibly from objects brought by traders. So it turns out that the similarity in art is not a sign of some kind of genetic connection between the continent and the British Isles. It's merely a sign that this art style proved enormously popular in certain parts of the British Isles. The striking thing about this insular art is that it ended up as the only place where this art style that came originally from Central Europe managed to survive. On the continent, it was pretty much swept away by the Roman conquest of Gaul. Very little of the earlier Latin style can be found after the 1st century AD. In Britain, the style goes underground somewhat during the period of Roman rule, but in Ireland it persists, and then in the early Christian period it bursts into new life, and a new art style emerges out of the old. Keep in mind that the original art style from Latin was already very eclectic. It blended elements from the many areas with which the peoples of Central Europe had trading contacts. The art of the early Christian period in the British Isles and Ireland is also a mix of elements. You see Celtic motifs that have been around for a while, but also borrowings from Germanic art, such as a strong emphasis on certain animal shapes, and the use of certain metalworking techniques like gold filigree. These would have been elements that had been brought into Britain by the Anglo-Saxon settlers, and also just by trading contacts with Germanic speakers from the continent. Another important influence on this art style was classical art from the Mediterranean area, which brought in certain vegetal motifs like the acanthus leaf, as well as broad ribbon interlace. This art had come into the picture largely due to the influence of Christian missionaries. All of these motifs were blended together in complicated, dense patterns that repeat over and over. You see these patterns consistently throughout various media. There are many such repeating motifs. The most common motifs are either curving patterns like spirals or interlaces, or more geometric patterns like frets or steps. But perhaps the most distinctive pattern in this art style is the repeating use of intertwined beasts, some of which are recognizable as real animals. Others seem to have been wholly invented. These patterns are extremely intricate, even more so than the original Latin art that they are building on, and they're very stylized. That is, the emphasis is never on the realistic depiction of objects, but rather on stripping them down to their geometric essentials and manipulating them to form abstract patterns. We see these basic aspects of insular art illustrated across many different media, so this is a consistent art style that was used everywhere the decoration was used. I'll talk about each of these media in turn. Let's talk first about metalworking. The techniques and motifs of early Irish metalwork seem to have come about in the 3rd and 4th centuries due to trading contacts between Ireland and Roman Britain. These are the earliest objects we have that display the newer hybrid art style that draws on various traditions, including the Latin motifs. Almost everything that survives in metalwork from early Ireland is related to religion in some way. Reliquaries and altar vessels were the most common, but you also see bells and bishop's croziers, that sort of thing. There is a notable exception, namely brooches, about which more in a moment. Probably the most famous liturgical object to survive from this period is the Ardagh chalice, which is on display in Dublin in the National Museum of Ireland. It has an interesting history. It was found in 1868 near a ring fort in County Limerick by 2 boys who were digging potatoes. Their spades struck something metallic, and they said, "What's this?" or something similar, and proceeded to discover this hoard. We have no idea when or why it was buried. It was common in this period to bury precious objects when you were worried about losing them to violence, which was all too common. Sometimes you came back to dig them up, and sometimes you didn't. So the loss of the person who buried the hoard is our gain. The chalice dates from about the 8th century. It is decorated with geometric interlace. But the truly amazing thing about it is the fact that the underside is also richly decorated. Now, why would you expend the effort to decorate the bottom of an object? Is this just a way of showing how great a metalworker you are? Well, remember what this is. It's a chalice for the wine that is turned into the blood of Christ during the Mass. At the moment of consecration, the chalice is elevated by the priest, and at that point, you can see the richly decorated underside. So the statement is that no part of this sacred object is unworthy of decoration. The decoration also makes a statement about the patron who paid for the chalice. Whoever it was a wealthy person, because then, as now, it is the labor that costs the most. So adding this decoration would have made the chalice much more expensive. One way to think about this is to consider how difficult it was to make objects. We can see this on a very intriguing kind of artifact called a trial piece. That is, a piece of bone on which a metalworker would practice the motifs that would later be incised on the metal. Very careful practice was required before you could transfer the patterns onto an actual metal object. The person or persons who created the Ardagh chalice had obviously trained for an extensive period before being able to produce this masterpiece. Another class of sacred objects that survives in relatively large numbers are reliquaries. A reliquary is a vessel meant to contain a relic, which is an object associated with a saint, either a part of the saint's body or some object associated with the saint, even bits of cloth that had touched their tombs. These are extremely common throughout Europe. In Ireland, we have a lot of them, dating especially to the 7th through the 9th centuries. They could be of various sizes, depending on whether they were supposed to be for personal use or communal use. Some reliquaries were mostly meant to be displayed in churches or in great religious processions. Others formed part of the personal devotions of an individual Christian. One example of such a personal reliquary is the Emly Shrine from County Limerick. It was made of lead tin hammered into yew wood, and it's small enough to carry on a cord around the neck. It's only about 4 inches by 2 inches by 4 inches in size. Some of these personal reliquaries were quite simple, but this one obviously has to have been owned by someone of considerable means. I mentioned that most metal objects that survive are religious in nature, but I want to talk now about a secular object, perhaps the single most famous metal artifact of early Christian Ireland, namely the Tara brooch. It's hard to overemphasize how important brooches were in this society. Think about a culture where you don't use buttons, let alone zippers. How are your clothes going to stay on? One of the most important garments that is mentioned consistently by people who describe the Irish is the mantle, which was worn by both men and women. It was basically a big cloak fastened over the shoulders with either one brooch or two. So there were obviously many, many brooches around at any given time, and they varied in quality according to the social status and wealth of the wearer. The Tara brooch is clearly a spectacular example. It is decorated with exquisite gold filigree triple spirals and scrolls and animal motifs. Similarly to the Ardagh chalice, the Tara brooch was dug up in the middle of the 19th century at Bettystown, County Meath, in 1850. It was a sensation. Queen Victoria loved it so much that she gave several replicas as gifts. Just like the Ardagh chalice, it was also richly decorated on the underside. Here there seems to be no rationale for going to the extra expense of getting the back ornamented. When you're wearing the brooch, you can't see the back. So it's really more about demonstrating opulence. The patron is so wealthy, he or she can afford this kind of extravagance. So Irish metalworking is evidence for a sophisticated clientele that could afford to pay for the very best. Of course, very much the same class of patrons probably sponsored much of the work in the next medium I want to look at, namely manuscript illumination. Now, let me stress something that I have been trying to say about some of the other objects we have looked at. Manuscripts, like reliquaries or brooches or liturgical vessels, came in all different levels of ornamentation. Some were clearly very basic, intended for practical use. They may have contained few, if any, illustrations. What we tend to focus on, though, are the most elaborately decorated manuscripts that come from the scriptoria, or writing rooms, of the richest religious houses. They have survived disproportionately because they are so beautiful, and they were treated with special care over the centuries. So don't think every Irish manuscript looked like the Book of Kells. The Irish were very well aware of how exceptional the Book of Kells was. The interesting thing about the manuscript illumination is that you see motifs that are very similar to what you see with the metalworking, but it's a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional process. It's as if the manuscripts are really trying to represent objects and motifs that people would have been familiar with from their daily experience. The high point of the Insular style, with regard to manuscripts, occupied a pretty narrow range in time, roughly from the late 7th to the early 9th century, so not more than about 150 years. We're not sure exactly why the style tended to fade away. There are theories, but we can't be certain. In all of these manuscripts, though, you will see the same basic elements, highly intricate and abstract interlace, and that is the figures are woven in and out of each other. The use of various animals, both real and imagined, as repeated decorative motifs, and highly stylized figures, with an emphasis on the two-dimensionality of the flat plane. The figures typically have no appearance of depth. I want to illustrate this last point by talking about two manuscripts side by side, each depicting the same subject, one of which was produced under straight-up continental influence, the other in the Insular style. And we can do this because there were only a few kinds of manuscripts that routinely got this kind of deluxe illustration, and they tended to depict the same themes. For example, a book of the four Gospels would often have portraits of each of the four evangelists. An example of the continental style would be the so-called Canterbury Codex Aureus, or Golden Book, and we have here a depiction of the evangelist St. Matthew. It dates from the mid-8th century, probably at Canterbury, and it was modeled on some of the books that went to Canterbury as part of the original mission of St. Augustine to preach to the Anglo-Saxons in the late 6th and early 7th centuries. Incidentally, this manuscript was captured by the Vikings in the late 9th century and held for ransom, which was paid. This is an indication of how important and how valuable these books were. The depiction of St. Matthew in the Canterbury Codex is somewhat naturalistic and three-dimensional. The evangelist's feet peek out from under his robes, and they have realistic-looking toes. You also get a sense from looking at his face that a real human being is being represented. But if you look at an insular manuscript, like the Book of Durrow, here St. Matthew really looks two-dimensional. His feet are represented as mere outlined shapes, and they're both pointing in the same direction. He doesn't look like a real person at all. Instead, he looks almost more like an excuse for all of the elaborate interlace decoration on his robe. The Codex Aureus St. Matthew is anchored in the real world because he is framed by architectural elements. The Book of Durrow St. Matthew is framed only by the highly abstract borders of the page. In fact, this abstract decoration was so important to the insular style that we see entire pages given over to these interwoven motifs. We call these pages carpet pages, and they were based on Eastern Mediterranean models, and they really do seem to carpet the page like an intricate Persian rug, only the motifs are insular. Some carpet pages were entirely abstract, but many carpet pages worked the cross into the pattern in various forms. For example, the Book of Kells includes a carpet page that has a cross with two arms, and the emphasis here is clearly on bilateral symmetry. The amazing thing about these carpet pages is not just how intricate they are, but how accurate they are. If you follow the threads through on a carpet page, you will find that the artist never drops a stitch, so to speak. The interlace works all across the page, and this is true for the drawings of animals also. Each animal was carefully drawn to a standard pattern that could be repeated over and over across the carpet page. And we know that they did these animals one at a time, not with a stencil or anything like that, because scholars have examined them very carefully, and there are tiny, tiny variations between them, almost invisible to the casual viewer. There is a truly astonishing uniformity of the animals, all drawn one by one, but to a model well worked out in advance. Just imagine the calculations required to make sure that they ended up with just the right number of strange beasts of a certain height. So far, I have mostly discussed pages that don't contain much text, but another prominent place for decoration was at the beginning of textual passages. A tradition started very early of decorating the first letter of a new section of the text, or sometimes the first few letters. You might have a very highly decorated initial, such as the Chi Rho at the beginning of the name Christ at the start of the Gospel of Matthew, and then the rest of the text on the page would follow using scripts of decreasing size and complexity. You might have capital letters, followed by a less formal script called uncial, then a still less formal script, and so on, with the letters getting smaller and smaller. This is called the hierarchy of scripts, and these different scripts could also be used for headings of varying levels of importance. It was obviously very hard to get the spacing right, and this demonstrates the very careful planning that had to go into the design of every page of a manuscript of this kind. It took a while to reach the complexity of a manuscript like, say, the Lindisfarne Gospels. The use of decorated initials developed over time. In the earliest manuscripts, the initials were quite small, but they got bigger and bigger, crowding out more and more of the subsequent text until they literally conquered the page and became almost like carpet pages themselves, as in the famous Incarnation initial from the Book of Kells. On this page, there is nothing other than the Chi Rho, and it's one of the most spectacular pages in all of insular art. Of course, the relationship between text and illustration was not always as arbitrary as in the decorated initials. There were also some depictions of subjects from the text itself. For example, there's a wonderful depiction in the Book of Kells of the temptation of Christ. In the picture, Christ is pictured on top of a structure that could be a temple, and below him, and to his right, is the devil, who looks rather skinny and pathetic, standing next to the majestic Christ. The intriguing thing about this illustration, though, is how closely related it is to contemporary metalwork. If we compare the Book of Kells illustration to the Emly shrine, which I talked about earlier, we see that the structure on which Christ is depicted is shaped just like the shrine, even if the decoration is different. So clearly, the manuscript tradition and the metalwork tradition are using very much the same store of images and motifs. So how do we account for this very close correspondence between the motifs and subjects depicted in these two art forms? It used to be thought that insular metalwork was copying the manuscript illustrations, But more recent work has argued that the manuscripts must be patterned on the metalwork. And this would make sense. Metal objects were far more numerous and circulated far more readily than did manuscripts. The creators of the manuscripts were copying things that they had seen and handled themselves. But metal objects were themselves patterned on objects produced in an even more ubiquitous medium, textiles. And this connection may already seem obvious just in the name of one of the most common kinds of motifs in insular art, namely interlace. And in fact, I have been using metaphors of textile production throughout this lecture. Insular art often looks as if it has been woven or stitched together, even though the manuscript paintings only exist in 2 dimensions. It's important to keep in mind that in early Irish society, which didn't place a strong emphasis on monumental building, one of the most important ways to display high social status was by the richness of what you wore on your body. We have already seen that with regard to jewelry, which would seem obvious, but it was also true with regard to clothing. People who could produce high-quality textiles were very highly regarded in this society. The most prestigious garments were those that had been elaborately embroidered, almost always by women. In the Irish system of setting the rate of compensation to be paid for injuring people of different social and occupational status, the honor price of an embroideress was higher than that of a queen. Unfortunately, textiles don't survive very well in the Irish climate, so we don't really know what these elaborately embroidered garments looked like. But given the very strong continuities between the motifs used in various art forms in insular art, we can certainly speculate that luxury textiles in the insular world were embroidered with motifs that are familiar to us from the great insular manuscripts. The elaborate embroidery that we see on, say, modern Irish dancing costumes may well represent a throwback to a genuine elite tradition from early Ireland. So metalwork and manuscript illumination probably share a common link to textiles, and there are certainly also close connections between these media and the last of the major art forms I want to discuss, namely stone carving. It is much more difficult to work with stone carving. We know less about stone carving than we do about manuscripts or metalwork because it has often suffered from exposure to the elements, and it can be harder to pin it down to precise dates than it is for manuscripts in particular. It's worth looking at stone carving, though, because even if you can't date every item precisely, it's possible to trace the development of various forms in relative terms. The earliest stone carvings that survive are simply inscriptions in a distinctive alphabet known as agam, in which the letters are formed by groups of horizontal or diagonal strokes on a central baseline, often formed from the side of a standing stone. These inscriptions, which date from the 4th to the 6th centuries, were mostly grave markers. As Ireland became more and more Christianized, these stones developed into Christian gravestones, and Latin letters replaced agam. You can find these gravestones either standing upright or recumbent, lying on the ground. For example, there's a grave slab from the important monastery of Clonmacnoise, dating from the 8th century, that is inscribed with a prayer for Tuachal the craftsman. The prayer is written to follow around the arms of the cross. The most famous stone sculptures, of course, are the spectacular high crosses. The origins of the high crosses are disputed, as they seem to have evolved in Ireland and Britain virtually simultaneously in around the 8th century, and you can remember that there was a lot of contact back and forth between the 2 islands. These crosses have a characteristic nimbus or circle around the cross point of the 2 shafts. This nimbus may have represented the celestial sphere, but it could also have had the practical function of helping to sustain the arms of the cross. This cross with a nimbus became enormously popular in the Gaelic revival movement of the 19th century, when it was first called the Celtic cross. These crosses were the sites of the same kind of intricate interlace motifs as we see in the metalwork and manuscript illumination we have already looked at. Later, crosses began to depict biblical figures, as in the Aheny cross from County Tipperary, which shows Adam naming the animals. One of the most spectacular examples is the 10th century Cross of Scriptures from Clonmacnoise. At the center you see the crucifixion of Jesus. At Clonmacnoise today, the version you see outside on display is a copy. The original is too precious to be displayed outdoors, so you can see it only in the museum. So what can we conclude from this very brief survey of insular art? What does this art tell us about the society that created it and valued it? I think the main lesson is this. Magnificent creations such as the Book of Kells and the Tara brooch demonstrate that elite patrons in Celtic-speaking areas were willing to expend substantial resources to create extremely intricate, labor-intensive works of art. There is certainly whimsy in this art style. Think of those fantastic beasts. But there is precision as well. We see a tension between the exuberance of an entire manuscript page given over to purely delighting the eye and the meticulous care required to make that exuberance look effortless. That, I think, is the genius of Celtic art.